Distinguished delegates, we are going to be starting in a few minutes. I encourage you to take up your seats, please. Distinguished delegates, good morning. I call to order the third meeting of the Committee of the Whole of the 14th session of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. As the first order of business this morning, I invite the committee to once again turn its attention to the appointment of the facilitators of its contact groups. It is my understanding that Mr. R.B. Lal of India has proposed as facilitator of Contact Group 1 on program and budgeting. May I take it that the committee wishes to appoint Mr. Lal as facilitator of the Contact Group 1? I hear no objection. It is so decided. Distinguished delegates, I invite the committee to continue its consideration of Agenda Item 3, entitled Effective Implementation of the Convention at a national, sub-regional, and regional levels. Sub-Item C, follow-up on the policy frameworks and thematic issues. Delegations will recall the committee considered the following issues under this sub-item yesterday: drought, sand and dust storms, gender, and migration. We shall now take up new and emerging issues. Land tenure. The committee has before it a document entitled New and Emerging Issues, Land Tenure, UNCCDCOP14/20. I now give the floor to the representative of the UNCCD Secretariat, Mr. Marcus Monterio, to introduce the report.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. As per the provisions of Rule 10 of the Rules of Procedures of the UNCCD Conference of the Parties, at its second intersessional meeting held in Guiyang, China on 26 February 2019, the Bureau of the 13th session of the COP endorsed the inclusion of a new agenda item on land tenure under the new and emerging issues for consideration at COP14. The Bureau further requested the Secretariat to submit a background document on that topic. In document ICCD COP14/20, the Secretariat provides the background information requested, includes comments received from parties and interest groups, and contains conclusions and recommendations for consideration of this committee. The document refers to the scientific conceptual framework of land degradation neutrality endorsed in Decision 18 COP13, which recommends the adoption of voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure of land, fisheries, and forests in the context of national food security, VGGT, authored by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. The VGGT provides practical guidance on how to protect the rights of local land users, especially those individuals and communities with no advocate in land use decision-making. Document ICCD COP14/20 explores the relationship between land tenure and land degradation in Chapter 2. Questions related to the integration of the VGGT into land degradation neutrality in Chapter 3, and the relation of UNCCD reporting on LDN with the reporting on a number of SDG indicators relevant to land tenure in Chapter 4. Based on the information collected in these chapters, document ICCD COP14/20 concludes that responsible land governance can be a fundamentally important component of sustainable land management and could contribute to the achievement of land degradation neutrality. Chapter 5, therefore, contains several conclusions and recommendations for consideration of this committee. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the representative of the UNCCD Secretariat for his statement and for informing the committee of the corrections to the report. Are there any delegations wishing to make a statement in connection with the report that was just introduced? My apologies. I need to give the floor back to the Secretariat to introduce the corrections to the report. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Apologies for that. Well, allow me at this moment also to inform the committee of some minor corrections to this report, which have been corrected in Arabic translation, but not in the other versions as follows. On page 4, paragraph 6, the first sentence should read as follows. Who owns land, who has rights to use land and natural resources, and how secure these rights are, significantly influence the way that land is managed. Second one, on page 11, paragraph 14, first sentence, should be replaced with the following. Support for the full complement of women's right to land, buying, selling, inheritance, etc., as outlined in the UNCCDCOP, not used as a set of secondary rights independent of their civil or marital status, but through equitable participation in governance of land tenure, is an important step in gender responsiveness for LDN. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the representative of the UNCCD Secretariat for his statement and for informing the committee of the corrections to the report. Are there any delegations wishing to make a statement in connection with the report that was just introduced? I give the floor to the European Union.
Thank you, Chair. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to speak on behalf of the EU and its member states. The EU sees responsible land governance and SDG target 15.3 on land declaration neutrality as intrinsically linked. The EU and its member states therefore highly welcome that land tenure is now addressed in the frame of the Convention. Access to land and secure land tenure rights have significant impact on livelihoods, management of natural resources and investments in sustainable land management. Apart from providing an enabling environment for sustainable agricultural development and the achievement of LDN, good land governance is essential for the respect of human rights and land rights. The EU pays particular attention to the essential role played by the indigenous peoples and local communities and customary land rights in addressing DLDD. We strongly encourage the legal recognition and recording of legitimate land tenure rights, not yet formally protected by law, consistent with national legal framework. At the same time, we support the view that no tenure right is absolute, but limited by the rights of others and public interest. Ladies and gentlemen, the EU takes note with appreciation of the positive results achieved through the LDN target setting program, and we encourage the Secretariat to further use this program in order to strengthen good land governance and land tenure rights. We would also like to encourage parties and the Secretariat to build on work carried out by and collaborate with other UN bodies, international and national organizations when addressing the issue of responsible land governance. The EU acknowledges that the Land Declaration Neutrality Fund has commenced operations and that more investments in LDN are needed. Responsible governance based on the VGGT and principles on responsible investment in agriculture and food systems ensure that LDN projects and investments in land are not doing harm at the local levels and that the rights on land of local stakeholders are respected. Information and transparency of investments in land, including the realization of free, prior and informed consent and meaningful participation of local stakeholders in decision-making processes are further elements of responsible investments into land. Also, the EU and its member states see timely and affordable access to justice and dispute resolution mechanisms as a crucial to be in place prior, during and after project implementation. These principles form the International Code of Conduct for Land Governance and are reflected in the new European Consensus on Development. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia.
شكرا.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We do appreciate the inclusion of this new item on the document on to this agenda on land tenure. We thank the Secretariat for this document and the Arabic amendment to it. Well, we draw the attention of the Secretariat that the Arabic translation is not up to the English texts. So this is key to us because land tenure handling is different from one country to another. Dealing with it nationally is also different in accordance with the specificity of the country and the stakeholders concerned. So I think we need to focus on topics that have to do with land management, because those experts in land management know the challenges faced that are highlighted in this document. So we would like our comment to be introduced to this document, and we do approve of this document, but we have to take into consideration the following: that any discussion on land tenure should be in the context of land degradation, as well as sustainable management of land and its resources. So we think that it is important that the outcome of this discussion be voluntary, and that do not contradict sovereignty and the specificity of each of our countries. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ghana.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, since this is the first time Ghana is taking the floor, I would like to take this opportunity to express our profound appreciation to the government and good people of the Republic of India for the warm hospitality extended to us since our arrival here in this beautiful city of New Delhi. Mr. Chairman, I'm actually making this statement on behalf of the African region. The African region has taken note of and endorsed the conclusions and recommendations presented by the UNCCD in document ICCD/COP14/20 regarding land tenure rights, security, and land governance. Whilst noting the sovereign nature of land tenure issues, we recognize the need for country parties working closely with the civil society to take center stage in building upon and implementing the recommendations for improved land governance towards achieving our LDN targets and the objectives of the UNCCD 2018-2030 strategy. Mr. Chairman, this notwithstanding, we observe that the effective implementation and the recommendations and the enormity of the issues involved go beyond the capacity of individual governments. A concerted effort involving all relevant stakeholders, which include national governments, the international community, funding agencies and sources, private sector, business entities, the UNCCD, UNCBD, UNFCCC, among others, will be required in the area of capacity building and knowledge sharing, among others. Mr. Chairman, of particular relevance is the integration of land tenure issues, VGGT, LDN, SDGs, and national strategies. In this context, the technical assistance and funding will be needed for the implementation of the following activities as elaborated in document ICCD/COP14/20. awareness raising and its accompanying capacity building, integration of multi-sector platforms, establishment of partnership, review of policies, laws, and legal frameworks, bringing voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of land tenure and specific guidance into plans to achieve LDN, the gathering relevant data, gender mainstreaming, funding, investment in the integration efforts, social and environmental safeguards, and finally integration into national policies. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ghana, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
谢谢主席。
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My delegation has noticed that at the second Bureau meeting of COP13 held in last February, the item of land tenure was put on the COP agenda. I'd like to stress here that this item is a new and cross-cutting item, and one must fully respect the national circumstances of the state parties, their laws and practices, and the mandate given by the UNCCD in carrying out relevant studies and future work. We'll take a constructive part in the future work on this agenda item. I thank you, sir.
I thank the distinguished representative of China, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eswatini.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Morning, ladies and gentlemen and colleagues. First of all, I would like to say that I'm in line with the statement presented by Ghana on behalf of the African Group. Mr. Chairman, I welcome the presentation of the document by the Secretariat and appreciate the work that has been done on this very, very important subject. Welcoming all the recommendations and everything, one has to raise one thing, that once you deprive a nation of its land rights, then you have deprived it of its sovereignty. It is on that background, Mr. Chair, that we should deal with this issue of land tenure with all the care that and caution that it deserves. It is true that in order to sustain a land degradation neutral status, you have to have supportive land government systems and also empowering the different stakeholders and players in the land rehabilitation network. Having said that, Madam Mr. Chair, we still believe and support those who says all the work that needs to be done under this subject so far needs to be voluntary because of the different situations and status on land governance in the different countries. So we stand ready to work with all the partners and see how best we can handle this very, very sensitive issue of land tenure. I thank you, Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of Eswatini, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lebanon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At the outset, we'd like to thank the Secretariat for introducing land tenure as a new item on the agenda. I also thank the Secretariat for the document submitted to us. Lebanon strongly support what was spelled out by the representative of Saudi Arabia, given the importance of what he said in LDN. I think we should work on a voluntary basis, and that is key to our efforts. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lebanon, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and ladies and gentlemen. Good morning to all of you. India congratulates the presentation of Mr. Marcos from UNCCD on the content of the documents COP14/20 on new and emerging issues, land tenure. Mr. Chairman, India appreciates the inclusion of land tenure as the new agenda in this UNCCD COP item, as it is an emerging issue globally. India encourages with the linkage between tenure security and land degradation. Mr. Chairman, the land tenure system in India is variable depending upon different physiographic units of India. Therefore, it's encouraged to standardize the measurement units along with uniform database generation system, and that need to be deployed by the country party. Mr. Chairman, the concept of integration of voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of the tenure with the implementation of land degradation neutrality is very important initiative and is welcomed by the Republic of India. Mr. Chairman, we also want to say that this subject of land tenure is very important and very sensitive and complex too. Therefore, India suggests this important topic needs to be deliberated with respect to the contact group and to deliberate what are the modalities on the voluntary basis. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of India, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Basically, Japan considers it is important to build up a responsible land governance, which contributes to sustainable land management. In this context, Japan considers that the content of the effort based on the investigation on the land tenure problem proposed by the Secretariat is appropriate. And Japan has an intention to keep an eye on the work and the discussion on land tenure in SPI and CST. At the same time, Japan would like to point out that we can find the word land tenures only in the Article 8(3)(c) of the Annex 1 of the Convention, which stipulates as measures to improve institutional organization, adjusting as appropriate the institutional and regulatory framework of natural resource management to provide security of land tenures for local populations. Japan concerns about the tendency to expand the scope of the convention. Finally, Japan would like to point out that it is acknowledged that the introduction of voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure should be in voluntary basis. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of Japan, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Yemen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank also the Secretariat for all their efforts. The representative of Yemen would like to express its support to Saudi Arabia to focus on on a voluntary basis for any discussion on this item. Thank you.
Of Yemen, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. South Africa is taking the floor in support of the position put forward by Ghana on behalf of Africa region and supported by many other African delegates. We absolutely agree with the view that improved land governance is critical for achievement of land degradation neutrality, as issue relating to who owns land, who has the right to use land and its resources, and how secure these land rights are significantly influence the way land is managed. We would, however, like to highlight that land tenure is a cross-sectoral issue affecting a number of departments at national level, including those dealing with land administration, land reform, rural development, local government, and traditional affairs. Therefore, it is imperative that proper and adequate consultation is undertaken at a national level with relevant role players on the content of the document under discussion. We believe that such an opportunity has not necessarily been afforded in this instance. Additionally, Mr. Chairman, the issue of land tenure is a very sensitive and emotive issue given cultural and political dynamics which come to play at times. And caution should therefore be exercised when dealing with this issue at different countries, as different countries are at different levels on this matter. Comprehensive research is also needed on the causal links between land tenure and land degradation, as our decision as the convention have to be based on sound science. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning. Switzerland recommends a strong recognition of the voluntary guidelines in the context of the Convention, not only for achieving the voluntary LDN targets, but also to combat DLDD. Secure tenure rights, legitimate and customary, are key. The voluntary guidelines were endorsed by the UNCFS. The Committee on World Food Security reports through ECOWAS to the UN General Assembly, and the UN General Assembly recognized the voluntary guidelines. Therefore, all parties in the room recognize these guidelines. Special emphasis should be on gender. Women providing most of the workforce in agriculture, but with limited access to land and with limited secure tenure rights. This is a global issue, but it's also true for Switzerland. In many countries, the right of women to own and use land is limited, and they have few opportunities to use new technologies, agricultural skills, development, and financial services. In Switzerland, women farmers' role is important, both socially and economically. Around 37% of Switzerland's agricultural sector is made up of women. They have diverse tasks, such as looking after the farming household, but also carrying responsibility and professional activities on the field and farm level. This is why both the Swiss government and interest groups are aiming to raise awareness at various levels about the importance of rural women and the special challenges they face, particularly in terms of legal status and social security. The voluntary guidelines, but also the CFS principles on responsible investment in agriculture and food systems, should be the basis for large-scale land restoration projects and other investments to combat DLDD, hopefully at the landscape level. We encourage the Secretariat to collaborate and cooperate with other stakeholders such as the FAO, the UN Habitat, with GLTN, ILC, and other relevant partners and to build on the strength and comparative advantages of all the different actors. We would encourage to use already agreed language in our decisions, such as responsible governance instead of good governance or land stewardship. Furthermore, the voluntary guidelines address already all relevant topics, and therefore we should refrain from picking out certain topics while neglecting others. In addition, true multi-stakeholder processes are at the center of the voluntary guidelines, and therefore they are indispensable in this context. Thank you, Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative from Switzerland, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Chair. In this statement, we would like to reiterate what we said yesterday when we spoke in the open dialogue with civil society organizations. And that is that for Colombia, the lack of legal certainty on land tenure is a factor that, among many others, has an impact on environmental degradation, including most notably land degradation. In this present statement, we would like to reiterate that instruments for national policies that have been developed in Colombia include goals and indicators which seek to legalize land ownership for indigenous communities and communities of African descent, to make progress in a housing registry for abandoned buildings, thus avoiding their undue occupation, and to avoid land hoarding. And additionally, this is a fundamental component in a comprehensive rural reform that my country has undertaken as part of the implementation of the final agreement for the end of the conflict in Colombia, which is why we believe that all national circumstances can be key in addressing land tenure, and these national circumstances must be taken into account. We have, however, a few misgivings about whether or not the UNCCD is the fitting forum for countries to begin to report or present information on a subject matter that could quite possibly be better debated in other fora of the United Nations. We would also like to focus on the capacity challenges that might be involved in collecting information on land ownership. And that could mean that fewer countries might be able to effectively fulfill the reporting obligations. We agree that addressing the guidelines of land tenure should be done on a voluntary basis. That said, though, we are willing to speak with other delegations about this as part of the dialogue in the contact working group. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Colombia, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Argentina.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Chair. To begin, Argentina would like to say that we conceptually recognize that land tenure is a factor that needs to be considered when we are speaking about sustainable land management. When we look at the three pillars of the Convention on Desertification, Land Degradation, and Drought. As other delegations who have spoken before me have referred to, such as Switzerland and Japan, Argentina believes that all emerging issues should not become the core center of the negotiations. Rather, they should be another factor that is included in the diagnosis and design of initiatives as part of the convention. Specifically, when considering the effective implementation of this in our countries and when supporting our national capacities in each country. Argentina welcomes the inclusion of land tenure, for we believe that it is something that, depending on national circumstances, should be duly taken into account. And yet, when we consider specific priorities and mandates of the convention, we see that we still have left pending other matters that are more urgent and more pressing. namely droughts. We also share Colombia's concern about the additional burden that the potential obligation of reporting on land tenure might be for countries. We would also like to say that the document presented, though welcomed by Argentina, uses nomenclature that is not common to the convention. This is terminology that would require more understanding and greater expertise. Now, it stands to reason Argentina would accept any kind of technical or financial assistance that is made available so as to address this issue at the national level. And as is to be expected of a country like ours, it would be done at the statewide level as well.
Tina, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Chair, thank you very much for giving me the floor. To speak about the UNCCD14INDIA document on land tenure, I can say that the Dominican Republic believes that this is an important document. Land tenure is a relevant and important topic. I would even say that land tenure is a necessary issue, and it has great repercussions on the economic and social development of all countries, particularly when trying to attain the Sustainable Development Goals. We believe further that we need to improve governance. And so, though the guidelines that have been presented are very important, specifically when they go into the role that women can play in attaining national goals, we believe that we need to focus on the voluntary nature of these guidelines and to pay a great deal of attention to national sovereignty. The Dominican Republic would like to underscore the need to improve the registration of land tenure and to set great store by the legal instruments that each country has developed for land tenure. These instruments need to be organized using technical criteria that take into account fairness and equity within each country. This is a concept that we presented yesterday as well. I would like to reiterate that the Dominican Republic is focusing on the voluntary nature of these guidelines and on national sovereignty. We would also like to say how important planning is, because in many countries, such as the Dominican Republic, land tenure is closely related to planning. In each country, there are various institutions that are in charge of planning and land tenure. In our case, it's the Department of Economy, Planning and Development. This department is facing a great number of challenges, and we would be interested in sharing this document with that department in our country. We will forward them the document UNCCDCOP14INDIA. That is all. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Chair. Kenya aligns herself with the position the African has taken, and Kenya appreciates the effort the Secretariat has put together in putting together the land tenure report. Like many African countries, land in Kenya contributes significantly to the economic, social, and cultural development, and therefore its sustainable use is vital in minimizing degradation and land desertification and land degradation, including minimizing land-related conflicts with regard to competing land uses. However, increasing subdivision of communal land, particularly in arid and semi-arid lands for sedentary livelihoods, among other challenges, limits sustainability guarantee for these ecosystems. Kenya therefore welcomes all efforts towards consideration of land tenure as a new agenda item under the emerging issues and further deliberations on addressing the same, and in particular, the issue of causal linkage between tenure security and land degradation. Thank you, Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of Kenya, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile.
Muy buenos días.
Very good morning, one and all. This is the first time that Chile has taken the floor here. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank the government of India for their hospitality and for the wonderful conference that they have organized. We would also like to thank the Secretariat for the reports that they have presented over the course of this week. We believe that these reports are guiding us along the right path. On the current item we are considering, we would like to say that the recovery of eroded land and the programs for the protection of land erosion that Chile has been implementing since 1996 begin with clarifying any issue related to land tenure and who the owner of the land is. Of course, it stands to reason that these efforts contribute to the legal certainty of land tenure and to food security. Once there is certainty on land tenure, then we can begin the programs to recover degraded land. And these efforts are undertaken by the Ministry of Agriculture. There, we give incentives to small and medium-sized owners to begin using the practices for the preservation of land and soil and water. Today, nearly 30 years after the program began, the program now has become a state policy. We're trying to develop programs that would allow our farmers to adapt themselves to new scenarios of droughts, land erosion, and climate change. Thank you.
Representative of Chile, and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Oman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the outset, we would like to thank the UNCCD Secretariat for including land tenure to the agenda of this conference, and we associate ourselves in this respect with the statement of Saudi Arabia. Soil is a national heritage, and the soil adaptation policies vary from country to country, but it is of utmost importance to all of us. Hence, we need to learn from previous experiences and be guided by the UNCCD in this respect. Thank you, sir.
I thank the distinguished of Oman, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Zimbabwe.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the floor. Zimbabwe fully supports the position of the African region on land tenure as an emerging issue that has been well articulated by the esteemed delegates of Ghana, Eswatini, and South Africa. The issue of land tenure is, however, sensitive, country-specific, and therefore national and local circumstances must be considered. Mr. Chairman, proper, effective, and meaningful consultations are therefore needed and critical on this matter. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Zimbabwe, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Namibia.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much for being given the opportunity. Namibia would like to align itself with the African position as presented by Ghana earlier on and appreciate the work done on this very important topic. We welcome the report and the recommendations. However, we have observed that gender aspects around land tenure could be strengthened in the recommendations. Namibia has embarked on the registration of customary land rights more than 15 years ago and learned valuable lessons which we are very willing to share. We have observed that while those who engage in initiatives around sustainable land management are 85% women, only 35% of all land titles in communal areas are held by women. And while statutory law addresses the needs of women, it is often the customary practices that disadvantage women. Especially against our ambitious LDN targets, factors on land tenure need to be considered. And therefore, we would like to suggest to look into the presented recommendations in order to ensure that gender aspects are sufficiently covered. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Namibia, and I give the floor now to the distinguished representative of the State of Palestine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the State of Palestine stresses that land tenure is a very sensitive issue that needs to be addressed cautiously. It has a political, economic, and social repercussions that are reflected differently on each country. Hence, I ask you to address it cautiously and to respect the national laws on each country in accordance to its needs and specificities. The State of Palestine has a different threat regarding the occupation by Israel and its control of its territories for the interest of the settlers and the change of the nature and demography of the land. The State of Palestine supports the position of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in this respect. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished delegate from the State of Palestine, and I now give the floor to the distinguished delegate from the Philippines.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, Mr. Chair, we greatly appreciate the UNCCD Secretariat for including the issue of land tenure as important agenda item at COP14, which means that the convention is putting the main concern of our smallholder farmers and community-based organization in the global discussion. Land tenure insecurity most often is the cause of conflict among land users within the community, identified as one of the barriers that hinder the adoption of sustainable land management and a driver of land degradation that results in unresolved poverty in rural areas. While resolving the problem related to land tenure, security is within the ambit of each individual party government to institute policies related to land governance. Putting land tenure in the global agenda highlight the concern of the Convention on the welfare of our smallholder farmers. Mr. Chairman, we believe that we cannot fully achieve land degradation neutrality by 2030 if we neglect addressing this problem of smallholder farmers fairly and squarely. Smallholder farmers' participation and engagement in our LDN program, I believe, is of paramount importance. Therefore, we appreciate this initiative of the Convention. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Philippines, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As we highlighted yesterday, Brazil is convinced of the importance of the voluntary guidelines, and we see the relevance of taking into account the guidelines as a whole and in taking account the context under which they were agreed upon for the benefit of the activities of UNCCD. That means recognizing its voluntary character, emphasizing the need for taking into account the national context, and in larger countries, but also countries with federal systems, and that even means sometimes in different internal legal definitions for land tenure and systems that will impact the implementation of activities related to the UNCCD. So when we talk about land tenure, that comes really the benefits that it brings to a greater environmental protection, to greater juridical security for landowners of all kinds, and also the importance of ensuring that women and also vulnerable groups may have their right to land assured. the implementation of these objectives depends mostly upon national legislation and implementation of that. And we believe here that the UNCCD can benefit from taking them into account, but not by creating further demands on reporting, and not by trying to translate the voluntary spirit of those guidelines into a particular track of work at UNCCD that ends up taking out space, effort, and resources from the main objectives that guide the work of this convention. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of Brazil, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Benin.
Thank you so much, Chairman. And given that this is the first time that Benin takes the floor, I would like to start by conveying my gratitude to the Indian government for their hospitality and warm welcome, and of course congratulate them for the outstanding organization of COP14. I'd like to thank the Secretariat for both the report and the actions which have been undertaken. Benin associates itself with the statement made on behalf of the Africa Group and other groups and countries which echoed it. Now, land tenure right is essential when it comes to achieving LDNs. I would like to focus on the fact that a great many African states, having, over a lengthy period of time, experienced the duality of customary law and modern land tenure law, have updated their legislation and brought in modern land tenure laws. However, the effectiveness of its implementation gives rise to a number of problems in terms of local governance, as well as, of course, the rights of the vulnerable strata of the population. It is essential to focus on local governments and, of course, land tenure rights of women, especially in rural areas. After all, most households there are agricultural farms. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Benin, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Angola.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. Good morning, colleagues. Angola wants to associate with what has been said by Ghana, who spoke on behalf of the African Group of Negotiators, and the previous speakers. Angola also is the opinion of that the land tenure is a critical issue in many of our countries. This is related to critical issues like in some countries even religion aspects, cultural and the political. So therefore we also suggest that UNCCD Secretariat would continue to engage with the counterparts and take into consideration all these aspects which I just mentioned, and to see if we can further engage other stakeholders and continue with further consultations so that we can then have more inputs from as many stakeholders as possible. Thanks very much.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Angola, and I now give the floor to the distinguished delegate of Haiti.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you so much, Chairman. My name is Idara Doda from the VDIT, and I would like to thank the government of India for having allowed us to come together here to cooperate in this COP14. Now, the issue of the land management in Haiti is, of course, one of great concern. And when we analyze these problems and how they're managed, we note that despite progress achieved over a number of years now, this activity, or this scourge, should I say, remains a very alarming one. In Haiti, and this is following the conclusions reached by the government. A number of institutions came together to draw up a basic land tenure right plan, and we cherish the hope that we will enjoy the support of all players and stakeholders. And since the opening of this COP, I can see that there is genuine synergy between UNCCD and the various implementing agencies. In Haiti, a great deal of assistance is provided by the implementing agencies and institutions, and I would like to see this form of synergy seep down to all levels. Local, well, international, we can see it's there. Regional, yes, but at the local level as well. Because very often the door is not left ajar for negotiations at the level of national plans of action and the activities of the government. And I would like to see the support, or to see support provided by all of these agencies in drawing up the land tenure plan we're working on in Haiti. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Haiti, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Guyana.
Thank you for giving me the floor, Mr. Chairman. Guyana expresses its thanks and appreciation to the UNCCD Secretariat for the introduction of the documentation before us on the newly emerging issue of land tenure. Mr. Chairman, naturally there is need for appropriate caution in treating with newly emerging issues. However, having said that, the surpassing relevance and intrinsic importance of land use in dealing effectively with all the key objectives of the UNCCD Convention has been well demonstrated. The Guyana delegation therefore shares the sentiments of many other delegations before us that the inclusion of this matter into the discourse on desertification, land degradation, and drought is relevant, important, and significant. I wish to underscore some areas of Guyana's experience in mainstreaming issues related to land tenure in the implementation of the Convention. First, on coordination and integration, Guyana's national focal agency to the UNCCD is also the National Land Administration Agency of the country. This is, of course, a fortunate coincidence. The agency has a specific role of being the guardian of all public lands of the country within the context of developing, implementing, and monitoring the legal regime through ownership and for effective occupation. Strategically, this makes it easier to integrate the work of the UNCCD into national land tenure processes on account of the recognition of the need for integration at the national level of these two closely linked issues. Of course, Mr. Chairman, property rights is also a priority for Guyana for the empowerment of our peoples, particularly indigenous people and those who are in vulnerable situations, who can access land through titling. Indeed, improved land governance becomes even more critical for resolution of tenure issues and therefore remains a priority for Guyana. Mr. Chairman, the government of Guyana, recognizing the importance of land tenure, has prioritized a national land policy under an existing project for sustainable land development management, supported by the FAO. The national land policy would provide strategic guidance for land management and administration, provide clarity in processes and procedures to strengthen legal instruments, land use of resources, land access and rights, and compliance with international agreements. Mr. Chairman, let me say a special word on the relationship with gender issues, which we consider to be pivotal. We believe that across the spectrum, women have a crucial role in managing land. Their involvement and improved access will empower them, to participate in the management of land issues. Significantly, very often, of course, the livelihoods of women is also tied to land and land security issues. Therefore, all the related issues of land security assumes even greater importance to the empowerment, decision-making, and even very much the capacity for decision-making and inclusion of women in the appropriate decisions. On this, I want to underscore that the land use and land security issue should not be treated in a vacuum. Indeed, given its strong interlinkage with poverty alleviation, resource management, and sustainable land management, ownership through land tenure rights must be considered as a first and necessary step, but not sufficient in and of itself. Therefore, there is need at the same time to create an enabling environment, including through such aspects as access to markets, relevant technologies, and concessionary finance and credit, among other things. Mr. Chairman, we also see the importance of increased and dedicated research and the availability of spatial data in pursuing an evidence-based approach to land tenure issues. To this end, the development of a national spatial data infrastructure and a national geospatial policy to guide the application of geospatial information and data management and sharing will be forthcoming. This result, we believe, will ensure transparency of tenure systems and informed decision-making among stakeholders. The enhancement of GIS, mapping, and other geospatial services in the context of land tenure would serve to identify land regularization needs and overlay land management issues and DLDD-related data. In this regard, we encourage the UNCCD to explore synergies with the United Nations Global Geospatial Information Management, to build data sets for countries on land administration, tenure, and DLDD, especially where capacity challenges exist. In Guyana, again, fortunately, the National Focal Point Agency to the UNCCD is also the focal point to the UNGGIM, and this has been an extremely helpful situation. Mr. Chairman, as I conclude, I wish to say a word on VGGT. As others have mentioned, and we share that view, that it is difficult for every country to mainstream VBGT, and therefore we would endorse the view that its implementation should remain voluntary. Indeed, while some aspects of the VGGT can be considered, local laws and contexts need to be taken fully into account before any of the guidelines can be integrated in the work of country parties. And this has certainly been the experience of Guyana. As we move forward in taking note of the current and future strategic framework of the Convention, and recognizing the need for the raising of awareness as put forward in the report before us, Guyana recommends to the Secretariat to identify and increase the provision of specific resources to assist us in raising awareness and to build capacity, not only for us but for all country parties in the pursuit of continued integration of land tenure into the Convention. Finally, Guyana is also undertaking an indigenous peoples land titling project to enable indigenous peoples to secure their property rights with a view towards the preservation of their customary and traditional practices, which guarantee, we are convinced, sustainable social and economic development and the well-being of Guyana's first peoples. To this end, Chair, and in summary, Guyana concurs with the fundamental importance of land use to the achievement of LDN. We welcome the report on land tenure and look forward to working with the Secretariat in form of mainstreaming this matter into our work. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the distinguished representative from Guyana. Distinguished delegates, we have come to the end of country parties' intervention, and I now invite the specialized agency, the Food and Agricultural Organization, to speak.
Thank you, Chair. FAO welcomes the note of the UNCCD Secretariat on the linkage between land degradation and land tenure to open a fruitful collaboration between these two disciplines to tackle land degradation. As highlighted by the UNCCD Secretariat note, land degradation is affecting 1.5 billion people, mostly farmers relying on customary land tenure rights. This fundamental importance of land governance and land tenure security is entrenched in the negative interaction between land tenure rights and land degradation. Land tenure security should be promoted in line with the voluntary guidelines on responsible governance of tenure for land, fisheries and forests, the VGGT. Since the adoption in 2012, FAO has supported the implementation of the VGGT in over 80 countries. FAO's work has focused on developing critical knowledge and tools, fostering alliances, promoting awareness, developing capacity, building consensus and coordination, improving legal and policy frameworks, and supporting the implementation. FAO is pleased to work with the UNCCD parties and Secretariat to promote cohesion across land tenure, land use planning and land management, including to promote the integration to the VGGT in achieving land degradation neutrality. In this spirit, FAO would like to propose the organization of a multi-stakeholder expert meeting on mainstreaming tenure governance to achieve land degradation neutrality in the framework of the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, in its headquarters in Rome, as part of the celebration of the World Day to combat desertification and drought on 17th June 2020, to advance the debate towards concrete actions in support of governance of tenure for LDN implementation. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Food and Agricultural Organization, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Holy See.
First, I'd like to thank Shri Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji, Shri Prakash Javadekar, Minister of Environment and Forest, India, and Shri Yogi Adityanath ji for hosting this event in his home state, Uttar Pradesh. It is a very well organized and a very warm program. So I'd like to thank the Secretariat for this opportunity to speak. This is our first contribution in the UNCCD COP14. I am Professor Luke Mendes and indigenous to the 7 islands of Mumbai or Bombay with a genetic heritage of 60,000 years in those same very islands through the National Geographic Program, the GENE program. So distinguished delegates in this panel and participating countries, I would like to urge you to consider the indigenous people of the world who have taken care of the land since millennia. Theirs is a time-tested method. Now, Pope Francis, in his encyclical Laudato Si, which means we praise thee, that is the land, he clearly mentions how we must go back to our indigenous ways and start caring for creation. Now, the indigenous have learned and adapted to various climate changes over millennia. Now, we must learn from them. The land is alive, as the indigenous believe, and the land recognizes the indigenous peoples too, for far more than any technology. The indigenous seeds on that land respond far better than any human-engineered seeds. Land tenure with regard to the indigenous people must include the indigenous of all countries, a stake or share of the land resources for the community. There are constitutional guidelines present in individual countries. Those constitutional guidelines on land tenure must not be diluted in those countries. And if there is no emphasis on the land tenure with regard to the indigenous peoples in other countries, I would urge you to look into the heritage of your country and preserve your ancient heritage, which is...
Unfortunately, I'll have to ask you to stop speaking at this time. I'm told that you're not the representative of the Holy See.
I am the representative of the Holy See.
You are the representative of the Holy See?
Yes, I am the representative of the Holy See.
Okay, my apologies. You may proceed.
Should I keep this here? Okay. Is that okay? Okay. So if there is no emphasis on land tenure with regard to the indigenous peoples in other countries, I would urge you to look into the heritage of your country and preserve your ancient heritage, which is the indigenous people and their millennia-old knowledge and systems, because that is the way forward. Now we must approach this Article 3C with sensitivity. We must also not forget the root of all conflict in the world is land and resources on that very land. We must also, at the UNCCDCOP14, create a forum where we can share this ancient value and wisdom of the indigenous people. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your intervention. I now give the floor to the representative of civil society, Sinesta from Iran.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, colleagues, my name is Nahid Naqizadeh, member of an Iranian civil society organization, Senesta. I present the statement of civil society organizations gathered here to share their points of view on new and emerging issue on land tenure. Land is one of the core elements to achieve SDGs, in particular Goal 15.3. Therefore, failure to resolve land issues will increase the barriers to achieve land degradation neutrality and land restoration within lands and territories of indigenous peoples and local communities. Evidence shows in the past decades existing approaches such as ignoring customary and collective tenure rights, technical-oriented approaches, and less proper or gender-sensitive approaches have not been successfully addressed the land tenure issues. Majority of countries facing challenges on securing land tenure and decreasing pressure on natural resources due to lack of proper policies and regulations, war, displacement of people, allocation of communities' lands to extractive industries such as oil, gas, and mining, big dams construction, urbanization, change of land use, in particular shifting the range lands to agricultural lands, agribusiness, or non-indigenous plants and crops, and conflicts. These are serious threats, and there is an urgent need to secure land tenure and land-based livelihoods of billions of peoples through improved governance of tenure for food security, poverty eradication as one of the most important elements to achieve land restoration and land degradation neutrality. Land degradation neutrality has been defined by SPI on having three fields of action. 1, avoiding land degradation, 2, reducing land degradation, and 3, land restorations. We too often overlook the first field, which has been enormous potential to avoid land degradation. Therefore, we call all decision makers to set a legal and policy support to recognize collective and customary tenure rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. We also propose recognition of customary land tenure through recognition of indigenous and community conserved territories and areas which accepted and approved by International Union on Conservation of Nature, IUCN, and parties of the UNCCD as the main type of governance categories for preservation, restoration, and sustainable use of nature and natural resources. We call all delegates and decision makers to include representatives of indigenous peoples, local communities, civil society organizations, women, youth, and vulnerable groups in land tenure security decision-making processes through a UNCCD COP14 decision and implementations of FAO voluntary tenure guidelines as a fundamental need for sustainable land governance at all levels. We also would like to ensure a gender-responsive consultation and participation process in case of land-related decisions, as women have reliable potential to make change to achieve land restoration and land degradation neutrality. So we propose land tenure security of communities in general, and women, young people, and vulnerable groups specifically must be secured through a UNCCD COP14 decision on implementation of FAO's voluntary tenure guideline. We appreciate the contributions of this debate by those parties, emphasizing the need for each country to take its own circumstances and tenural arrangements into consideration. We recognize that reporting on this issue will create additional work for the parties. However, because insecure tenure is coupled to unsustainable land use, we believe that this issue should be reported on by parties, as this will ensure that the issue enjoys greater priority at the national level and also enable important lessons in this regard to be shared amongst the parties. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the representative of civil society. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, there are no more speakers on my list under this issue. I therefore give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat to respond to the questions and comments from the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, distinguished delegates, for the fruitful interventions, and the points have been well taken here, and we can see that there are a very interesting way of approaching and seeing the recommendations put in front of this committee for the issue of land tenure. Indeed, it's a very sensitive issue, it's a very important issue also, and this will be definitely discussed in the contact group, perhaps, as some of the countries were mentioning. We have been taking good note of all the interventions, including the aspects related to the VGGT, the importance of taking into consideration what are the national regimes and the issue of sovereignty, and others that will make sure will be included and put it into the draft decision that will be put in front of the parties during the contact group. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
I thank the representative of UNCCD Secretariat for his comments. Distinguished delegates, we have just concluded our program of work for this morning. I now, however, hand the floor to the Secretary for some to give some information regarding contact groups.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The contact group on other matters will meet immediately following the adjournment of this meeting in room Met 12, which is on the ground floor. Thank you.
Thank you. The timing of the next meeting of the committee will be discussed by the Bureau and will be published in the journal in due course. This meeting now stands adjourned.